the uh, the, the sound guys. I can't even call all their names and everything, but they all done a fantastic job. And anytime you want us back, just
For decades, a secret recording stayed locked away in a closet, containing Elvis Presley's final conversation just hours before his death. The tape captured something no one expected: raw confessions, haunting melodies, and a desperate search for peace. What did Elvis say in those final hours that changed everything we thought we knew about his death? The restless night at Graceland. The house was too quiet. That was the problem. Elvis had been awake for hours, wandering through Graceland like a stranger in his own home. His bare feet barely made a sound on the thick carpets as he moved from room to room, unable to shake the weight pressing down on his chest. It was past 3 in the morning on August 16, 1977, and sleep felt like something that belonged to other people now. Charlie Hodge sat in the corner of the living room, pretending not to watch. He had seen Elvis like this before, restless, caught up in his own head, moving through the darkness like he was searching for something he couldn't name. Charlie never asked questions during these nights. He just stayed close, ready if Elvis needed anything, but mostly he just watched and waited. Elvis stopped near the piano and ran his fingers across the keys without pressing down. His mind was somewhere else entirely. He thought about the concerts, the screaming crowds, the flash bulbs that never stopped popping. He thought about how many people knew his face but had no idea who he really was. They loved Elvis Presley, the performer, the legend, the man on the stage. But did anyone really know the kid from Tupelo who used to pray with his mama? Did anyone care about that version of him anymore? He picked up a pen and started scribbling on a notepad he'd left on the table earlier. Random thoughts, half-finished prayers, questions he didn't know how to answer. The words came out messy and disconnected, like his thoughts were moving faster than his hand could keep up. He wrote about forgiveness, about being tired, about wondering if people would remember him as a real person or just as an image frozen in time. The house felt enormous around him, all those rooms, all that space, and yet he felt trapped. Fame had built walls he couldn't climb over. Every relationship felt complicated. Every conversation felt performed. Even in his own home, surrounded by people who worked for him, he felt completely alone. Ginger was upstairs sleeping. Priscilla was gone, living her own life now. His mama had been gone for years, and he still wasn't over it. Nothing felt simple anymore. Elvis walked to the window and stared out at the dark lawn. Somewhere out there, beyond the gates, people were sleeping normal lives. They woke up, went to work, came home to their families. Nobody knew their names. Nobody cared what they wore, or who they loved, or whether they gained weight. They were free in a way he would never be again. He had traded that freedom for something he thought he wanted, and now he couldn't find his way back. He turned away from the window and caught Charlie's eyes across the room. Neither of them said anything. What was there to say? Elvis picked up the notepad again and stared at the scribbled mess of words. Somewhere in that chaos was a truth he needed to face. Somewhere in the exhaustion and the loneliness was a conversation he'd been avoiding for years. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, the restlessness had a purpose. There was someone he needed to talk to, someone who might actually understand. The question was whether he had the courage to make the call. Haunted by fame and memory, Elvis couldn't stop thinking about Priscilla, not in the way he used to, not with longing or regret about the divorce. It was something quieter than that. He thought about the early days, back when things were simple between them, when she looked at him and saw just a man, not a monument, when they could sit together without the weight of expectation crushing every moment. Those days felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. Ginger was upstairs, probably still asleep. She was young and sweet, and she tried her best to understand him. But how could she? How could anyone understand what it felt like to be constantly watched, constantly judged, constantly performing even when the cameras were off? He cared about her, but there was a distance between them he couldn't bridge. Maybe the distance was his fault. Maybe he'd forgotten how to let people in. He moved toward the music room, drawn there by muscle memory more than conscious thought. The piano sat waiting in the dim light. Elvis lowered himself onto the bench and let his hands find the keys. Gospel melodies came to him without thinking. The old hymns his mother used to sing. The songs that used to bring him peace when he was just a kid with a dream and a guitar. His voice came out soft and rough as he hummed along. Peace in the valley. How great thou art. The songs that reminded him of who he used to be, before the world decided who he should become. Gospel music was the only thing that still felt real. Everything else in his life had been twisted and packaged and sold, but gospel stayed pure. Gospel remembered the boy from Tupelo. The exhaustion sat heavy in his bones. It wasn't just physical tiredness, though his body ached constantly these days. It was something deeper, emotional exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. He was 42 years old and he felt ancient, used up, like he'd lived 3 lifetimes in the space of one. People saw the jumpsuits and the jewelry and the mansion, and they thought he had everything. They didn't see the isolation. They didn't see how fame had become a prison with golden bars. They didn't understand that you could be surrounded by people every single day and still feel completely alone. That you could have millions of fans and still wonder if anyone actually knew you. Elvis stopped playing and sat in silence. The house seemed to hold its breath around him. He thought about all the times he'd smiled for cameras while dying inside. All the interviews where he'd given them the answers they wanted instead of the truth. All the performances where he'd hidden behind the persona because showing the real man felt too dangerous. His biggest fear wasn't death. It was being misunderstood forever. Being remembered as just an image, a caricature, a collection of greatest hits and Vegas shows. He wanted people to know there was a real person under all of it. A man who prayed, a man who struggled, a man who loved his mama and missed the simplicity of his childhood and wondered if he'd made the right choices. He looked down at his hands on the piano keys. These hands had signed 1,000 autographs, had worn rings worth more than most people made in a year. But right now, they just felt tired. Everything felt tired. The gospel melodies kept running through his mind even after he stopped playing. They reminded him of Rosetta Brown, the singer who'd told him something years ago that he'd never quite forgotten. Something about forgiveness and grace. Something he desperately needed to hear again. Maybe it was time to stop running from that conversation. The number he avoided for years. Elvis found himself standing by the phone in the hallway, staring at it like it might bite him. He'd walked past this same phone 100 times tonight, but now he'd actually stopped. His hand hovered near the receiver, then pulled back. This was ridiculous. He was Elvis Presley. He'd performed for presidents and royalty. He'd faced down crowds of thousands without breaking a sweat. But making one phone call had him frozen like a scared kid. He picked up the receiver, then set it back down. Walked away, came back. The pattern repeated itself 3 or 4 times before he even admitted to himself what he was doing. Or rather, what he was avoiding doing. There was a small address book on the table nearby, worn at the edges from years of use. Elvis flipped through it slowly, past names he barely remembered. Business contacts, old friends who drifted away, people who wanted something from him. He kept turning pages until he found what he was looking for. A number written in faded ink. No name next to it, just the digits. But he knew exactly whose number it was. Rosetta Brown, a gospel singer, a woman of faith. Someone who'd looked him in the eye years ago and talked to him about grace like she actually believed it could save people, like she believed it could save him. He'd met her at a gospel concert in Memphis. Must have been 10 years ago now, maybe more. They'd talked backstage about music and faith, and the struggle of staying grounded when the world wanted to turn you into something you weren't. She'd told him that God's forgiveness was real, that it didn't matter how far you'd fallen or how lost you felt, that there was always a way back home. Elvis had, smiled and thanked her, and promptly spent the next decade trying to forget that conversation. Because believing in forgiveness meant admitting you needed it, meant admitting you'd made mistakes, meant facing all the things you'd been running from. His notepad sat nearby, covered in crossed-out names and half-finished thoughts. He picked it up and stared at the mess of words. Most of them were names of people he'd considered calling tonight. Old girlfriends, band members, his father, who was somewhere else in the house but felt a million miles away. He'd crossed out every single name, except one. Rosetta's name stood out in the middle of the page, circled twice, underlined, like his hand knew what his mind was still trying to deny. He remembered something else she'd said that night. Something about how the hardest prayers were the ones we needed to say the most. How running from God was just another way of running from yourself. How eventually you had to stop running and face the truth. Elvis picked up the phone again. This time, he didn't put it down. His fingers moved slowly, dialing the number he'd memorized years ago, but never had the courage to use. The phone rang once, twice. His heart hammered in his chest, then he hung up. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet, but soon. The call that almost was Elvis stood with the phone in his hand for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince himself this was a terrible idea. It was the middle of the night, and he was about to call someone he hadn't spoken to in years, someone who probably didn't even remember him the way he remembered her. What was he supposed to say? How do you explain to someone that you're drowning in your own life, and you need to hear that there's still hope for people like you? He dialed again, and this time he let it ring. 3 times, 4 times, 5. His pulse was racing and he almost hung up again, almost gave in to the fear that had kept him silent for so long. Then someone picked up. A man's voice, groggy with sleep, answered with a confused hello. Not Rosetta, but her husband, irritated at being woken up at this ungodly hour. Elvis froze, and for a second he couldn't remember how to form words. The voice on the other end asked who was calling, and Elvis could hear the suspicion creeping in, the annoyance of a man dragged from sleep by what he assumed was a wrong number or a prank. Elvis cleared his throat and managed to speak, keeping his voice low and careful. He didn't give his name because what was the point, and he didn't want to turn this into something it wasn't. He just asked if Rosetta was available, and the husband said she was sleeping. Asked again who was calling, and why it couldn't wait until morning, like a normal person would do. The words came out in a rush then, not rehearsed or polished, but raw and honest. Elvis said he just wanted to thank her for something she'd told him years ago, something about forgiveness and grace that had stayed with him even when he'd tried to forget it. He said she'd probably moved on with her life and wouldn't even remember the conversation, but it had mattered to him, mattered more than she could know. He said he was sorry for calling so late, and he hoped she was doing well, and that was all he needed to say. The husband's voice softened a bit, confused but no longer angry. He said he'd give Rosetta the message in the morning and asked one more time if Elvis wanted to leave a name. Elvis thanked him and said no, just tell her someone remembered what she said, and it helped. Then he hung up before the man could ask anything else. Something shifted in Elvis after that call. Like a door he'd been holding shut had cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. He'd reached out, even if he hadn't said everything he needed to say, and even if Rosetta had no idea it was him. The simple act of trying had loosened something in his chest. But he knew now with absolute certainty that there was one more conversation he had to have, one more connection he needed to make before it was too late. And this time, he couldn't hide behind cryptic messages or nameless gratitude. This time, he had to be brave enough to tell the truth. The final conversation begins. The phone rang at dawn, and Elvis picked it up on the first ring, like he'd been waiting for it his entire life. Maybe he had been, and just didn't know it until now. Rosetta's voice came through the line, warm and surprised, and exactly as he remembered it from all those years ago. She said her husband had given her the strangest message about someone calling in the middle of the night to thank her, and she'd had a feeling, just a feeling, that it might have been him. Elvis felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he couldn't speak at all. How did you start a conversation like this after years of silence? Years of running from the very thing you needed most. But Rosetta didn't push and didn't demand explanations. She just waited with the kind of patience that comes from real faith and real understanding. Finally, he managed to say her name and admit yes. It had been him calling, and he was sorry for the late hour, but he'd needed to reach out. She told him there was nothing to apologize for and asked how he was doing, really doing. Not the rehearsed answer he gave reporters, but the truth. Something in her voice broke down the last of his defenses, and the words started pouring out before he could stop them. He told her he was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix, and that he felt more alone now than he'd ever felt in his entire life. He told her about the crowds and the performances, and how none of it meant anything anymore, because somewhere along the way he'd lost himself in the image everyone else had created. Rosetta listened without interrupting, and he could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, steady and calm while his own breath came in shaky bursts. He talked about the fear that kept him awake at night, the terror that when he was gone people would only remember the costumes and the hits and the spectacle, but never the real man underneath all of it. He confessed that he didn't know who that real man even was anymore, after spending so many years being what everyone else needed him to be. She asked him if he still prayed, and the question hit him harder than he expected. He admitted that he tried, but the prayers felt empty lately, like they were bouncing off the ceiling instead of reaching heaven, like God had given up on him the same way he'd given up on himself. Rosetta's voice got firmer then, not harsh, but strong, and she told him that wasn't how grace worked, and it wasn't how God worked either. She reminded him of their conversation all those years ago, and asked if he remembered what she'd told him about forgiveness. Elvis said he remembered every word, and that's why he was calling now, because he needed to hear it again. He needed someone to tell him there was still hope for people who'd made as many mistakes as he had. Rosetta told him to take a deep breath and listen carefully, because what she was about to say was the most important thing he'd ever hear. Confession, forgiveness, and peace. Elvis listened as Rosetta began to speak about grace in a way that made it feel real, instead of just a word preachers threw around on Sunday mornings. She talked about how God didn't keep score the way people did, and how forgiveness wasn't something you had to earn through good behavior or perfect living. It was a gift that was already there waiting for you to accept it, waiting for you to believe you were worthy of it even when you felt like the furthest thing from worthy. He found himself talking about his mother then, about Gladys, and how much he still missed her even after all these years. He told Rosetta about growing up in Tupelo, in that tiny house where they barely had enough to eat, but his mama always made sure they had enough love to go around. He remembered the prayers they'd say together before bed, and how safe he'd felt believing God was watching over them. Somewhere between Tupelo and Graceland, he'd lost that feeling of safety, and he didn't know how to get it back. Rosetta asked him what he thought his mother would want for him now, and the question made his eyes burn with tears he'd been holding back for too long. He said she'd want him to be happy, and to find peace, and to remember that he was loved, not for what he accomplished, but for who he was. She'd want him to forgive himself for all the things he thought he'd done wrong, and all the ways he thought he'd failed her memory. The fear came spilling out then, the deep terror that had been eating at him for months, or maybe years. He was afraid people would only remember Elvis the performer, the guy in the white jumpsuit who couldn't stop eating, and couldn't stay married, and couldn't handle the pressure of fame. He was afraid they'd turn him into a punchline, or a cautionary tale, and forget there was ever a real person behind the legend. He was afraid of being frozen in time as something he never really was. Rosetta's voice was gentle but firm when she told him that wasn't his burden to carry anymore. She said he couldn't control what people would remember or how they'd tell his story after he was gone. All he could control was whether he made peace with himself and with God right now, in this moment, while he still had the chance. She told him that grace covered everything, even the things he was most ashamed of and most afraid to admit. Elvis asked her in a voice that came out barely above a whisper if she thought people would remember that he tried, that despite everything he really did try his best, even when his best wasn't good enough. Rosetta told him that trying was all anyone could ever do, and that God saw his heart, even when the world only saw his mistakes. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Elvis felt something like calm settle over him. The farewell on the phone line. Elvis felt the weight in his chest begin to lift as Rosetta continued to speak about mercy and second chances, and the kind of love that didn't depend on performance or perfection. He realized this conversation was exactly what he'd been searching for during all those restless hours pacing through Graceland. This was the peace he'd been chasing, and couldn't find in the pills or the applause or the empty reassurances from people who needed him to keep being Elvis Presley instead of just being himself. But there was something else settling over him too. Something quieter and more final. A sense that this conversation was leading somewhere he couldn't quite name, but somehow already understood. He told Rosetta he was grateful for her time and for her patience, and for reminding him that forgiveness was real. His voice grew softer as he admitted he didn't think he had much time left, and he needed her to know this call had meant everything to him. Rosetta's breath caught on the other end of the line, and she started to say something about getting help or talking to someone or not giving up. But Elvis gently interrupted her. He told her it wasn't like that. Or maybe it was, but not in the way she thought. He just had a feeling deep in his bones that things were coming to an end, and he wanted to make sure he'd said what needed to be said before it was too late. The melody came to him without thinking, and he started humming "Peace in the Valley," so quietly she could barely hear it. The old gospel song his mama used to sing, the one that always brought him back to simpler times when faith felt easy and hope felt possible. His humming was off-key and fragile, but Rosetta didn't say anything, just listened as he worked his way through the verses he'd known since childhood. When the humming faded into silence, Elvis whispered "thank you" one last time. He told her she'd given him the gift of knowing he wasn't beyond saving, and that maybe, when people told his story someday, someone would remember he was just a man trying to find his way home. Rosetta was crying now. He could hear it in her breathing, and she told him she'd never forget this conversation, and she'd pray for him every day for the rest of her life. Elvis said goodbye in a voice that sounded like letting go and like relief all at once. He set the phone down gently but didn't hang it up all the way, his hand trembling as he pulled away from the receiver. The line stayed open, still connected, capturing the quiet sounds of him walking away and the distant echo of the empty house settling around him. Rosetta stayed on the line for a long time afterward, listening to the silence and the faint sounds coming through from Graceland, somehow knowing she just heard a farewell, even though neither of them had said the word goodbye. The tape that changed the ending? Rosetta kept the recording of that phone call private for decades, locked away in a box with other precious memories she couldn't bear to share with a world that wouldn't understand. She'd realized hours after hanging up that her phone had an old answering machine connected to it, one that had been set to record all incoming calls because her husband used the line for his small business. The entire conversation had been captured by accident, preserved on a cassette tape that sat in her closet gathering dust while the world mourned Elvis and turned him into exactly what he'd feared becoming. She listened to it only once in all those years, late one night when she couldn't sleep and needed to hear his voice again. The sound of him humming "Peace in the Valley" broke her heart all over again, and she put the tape back in its box, determined to let it stay buried with her when her time came. This was a private moment, a sacred conversation between a suffering man and his faith, and it didn't belong to the fans or the historians or the people who'd made careers out of dissecting every moment of Elvis Presley's life. But after Rosetta passed away, her daughter found the tape while going through her mother's belongings. She listened to it with tears streaming down her face, hearing the raw vulnerability in Elvis's voice and the gentle wisdom in her mother's responses. She knew immediately this wasn't just another piece of Elvis memorabilia to be sold or exploited. This was something that could change how the world remembered him. She contacted audio experts who verified the recording was authentic, that the voice was undeniably Elvis, and the timestamp showed it had been made in the early morning hours of August 16, 1977, just hours before his death. The family made the decision together about what to do with the tape, and they chose carefully, rejecting offers from tabloids and collectors who saw only dollar signs. Instead, they created a limited listening exhibit at a small museum in Memphis, one that focused on Elvis's gospel roots and his spiritual journey. Visitors could enter a quiet room one at a time, put on headphones, and hear the last conversation Elvis Presley ever had, the one where he finally found the peace he'd been searching for his entire life. The reaction from fans was unlike anything anyone expected. There was no frenzy or exploitation, no sensational headlines or conspiracy theories. People emerged from that listening room in silence, many of them crying, most of them changed by what they'd heard. They'd gone in expecting to hear the voice of a legend and come out having met a human being, a scared and exhausted man who needed forgiveness and found it just in time. The narrative around Elvis's death began to shift slowly but surely. The tabloid stories about pills and excess didn't disappear entirely, but they were joined by something deeper, something truer. People started talking about Elvis's final hours not as a tragedy of fame gone wrong, but as a story of redemption and grace. They remembered the boy from Tupelo, who never stopped loving gospel music and never stopped searching for God, even when the world made it nearly impossible to hear anything beyond the noise of celebrity. The tape stayed in that quiet museum room where people could choose to listen or not, where Elvis's voice would forever be humming "Peace in the Valley" and admitting his fears and finding his way home. Rosetta's daughter said her mother would have approved of this, of letting Elvis finally be remembered the way he'd asked to be remembered on that last phone call. As a man who tried, who struggled, who found peace at the end, and who never stopped being human underneath it all. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.